Okay, I've looked at the inside of French ready-to-wear, and it's a very interesting combination of sewing techniques. So here's one of my patterns, a little vest that was very inspired by what I saw. A lot of times when you look at a garment on the hanger, all you see is the center back seam. So they use a bias binding a lot in combination with other sewing techniques. So for instance, on this little jacket, I've serged some of the seams, but some of the edges are bound. And I've used a contrast stripe for the facing at the armhole. So I collect certain kinds of fabrics to use in this way. I had used a little scrap of extra fabric on the back, just for fun, just as a little focal point, as a little design interest. I easily could have used the same fabric, or I could have used the fabric that I used on the facing, but I find 3 is a magic number. So I did it that way. I just used a plain cotton binding at the center back because I've seen that again in French clothes. So here we have the binding along the facing because it was flat. These are spur of the moment judgment calls for me. This is one of my jacket patterns where I have used, again, I bound the pocket and the edges, but these seams I did not bind because I thought they might be a little heavy. So I just used the serger. So it's totally okay to use the serger in combination with binding. Here's another example. See? So here, denim. And this was in my collection. It was just a funny kind of a polka dotted lining. And when I cut it on the bias, by gosh, the dots lined up. I couldn't believe it. And here's another example. So this is this particular pattern. It's Vogue 8600. The construction on this is interesting, and this is something I was seeing in French ready-to-wear, where the whole front of the garment is self-lined, either with the same fabric or with a similar fabric and a different fabric in a similar weight. And then in this particular jacket, again, this is a silk, so I used a nice acetate lining fabric to bind the seam with. And the sleeve, I just serged together. Now, why would I not bind the sleeve? Because of the weight. Because just serging the 2 seams together is a better design solution than to try and bind them. So it's interesting, having learned to sew in mid-century America, there were a lot of rules in sewing at that time, and in those days we would have bound the whole thing. And now that I'm looking at a more practical and more pragmatic solution to sewing problems, I'm combining the 2. So it just gives you something to think about. Here is this little vest. So this is a vest I made for myself this season to take to Paris. And first of all, I know if I have a smooth, interesting, textured black vest, I will wear it all winter long. I will wear it in the spring in fall as a little jacket. So this is a polyester matelassé. What I like about this fabric is that it slips on and off really easily. Here I used a binding that started out black and white. I didn't have the right fabric in my stash. So this was a black and white silk, and I can show you what it looked like to start with. This shows you the extremes I will go to make something work. I did not have the right fabric for the binding on this. What I did have in my stash was a black and white dupioni, but to me it was just a little too high contrast. So what I did was I cut my bias strips and I cut my facing pieces, and then I painted them with Dynaflow liquid paint, which is like a dye. And so if you look at this carefully, you'll see the colors aren't regular, but it's not such a harsh transition as the totally white. And then when I went to make the little pocket, the pocket came because you will not find a pocket on the pattern. But once I started thinking about a little jacket for travel, I have to at least have a place to put a Kleenex and a $20 bill or a 20 euro bill. So where I started was I've been working with this little tuck pleat pocket. I like the effect of it a lot. I started, this was my first rendition, so I knew I was going to pleat it. I took the bottom curve from the curve on the bottom of the jacket. I experimented with this size pocket was just too tiny. So then I expanded it, and if you can see the curve is pretty much the same on these two. And when you go to sew it, what I did was I pressed the edge under, and then I just took a piece of the bias, zigzagged it on to hold that in place, and then I stitched a tuck, just like you would stitch a dart, actually. I just would take it, fold the pocket in half, and stitch like an unfinished dart, and you get this nice little tuck that you can then press flat. And it also takes on a little curve. And then I press my edge under and zigzag around the edge, and the pocket is done. So the design of the pocket relates to the other pieces that are going on in the garment. So for instance, I would never put a square or a pointed pocket on this garment because everywhere else we're working with curves.